Callahan, will you call the roll, please?
Mrs. Sloan. Mrs. Johnson. Mr. Bear. Mr. Greenstein. Mrs. Nadolny. Mrs. Weisberg. Thank you.
I'll make a motion for the adoption of the agenda, February 2nd, 2016. Do I have a second? Mr. Greenstein, all in favor? 5-0. Where am I? Student and community comments. We will now open to student and community comments. If you could please introduce yourself for the record, and remember we have a 3-minute limit. Alrighty, we will proceed to my opening statements, and I will be just as brief as the opening comments and turn it over to the superintendent.
Thank you, Mrs. Sloan. I do want to thank everyone who came out tonight. I hope everyone is enjoying our winter thaw, and thank goodness, from my perspective, all of the usual suspect groundhogs, they did not see their shadow today. There was consensus and agreement, so that's supposed to be for early spring. So all I have to say is what a difference a year makes. Just a few brief items. I wanted to congratulate Manor Haven for a very successful Cultural Studies Week. There's quite a bit of media coverage this year, so if you'd like to see actually a little bit more of how Manor Haven was transformed into Switzerland, there is a little piece on News 12. It's really wonderful, so great job for everyone who worked so hard on that. At Weber, there have been the Weber 101 orientation sessions for 5th grade parents. There was a session last week, and there is one this Thursday to talk to parents about how to work through the transition and give parents a little bit more information about Weber. I do have a very brief update on the LIPA situation. The district did join with other school districts in a lawsuit, and we have been at least successful in receiving some of the monies. But for just 1 second, I'm going to just turn it over to Mrs. Callahan so she can just give a very accurate explanation of what occurred.
Thank you, Dr. Mooney. As noted, the district did join in a lawsuit. Apparently, LIPA had paid the county just short of 1/2 of the what we would have called otherwise tax money back in November. The county did not forward it to the school districts because there must be something in the county law that says they're not allowed to accept a partial payment. That's between LIPA and the county, but at this point, as a result of this action, this joint action by school districts, we did receive somewhat short by about $100,000 what we had anticipated getting, and hopefully in the second half of the year, in May or June, we will see the balance of the monies that are due to us. There are still remaining questions that will impact the tax levy going forward and where taxes are charged, whether it's to the homeowner or the Class 2 or Class 3 property owners. But for the moment, I feel somewhat a bit of relief that we did receive $1.7 million of the 3.7 that is due us. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, Mary, very much for being on top of that situation, and also to our legislative task force who really took a hard look at it, and we're pleased that there's been some progress in this area. It still remains, though, of concern to all of us, and we can't let up any of the pressure. On a related note, I do want to thank again the legislative task force for working on the issue of the GEA and coming up with a letter an advocacy letter for our parents and really anyone in the community who would be so inclined to sign the letter, and then to now thank our Parent Council and HSA PTA co-presidents for circulating that letter, gathering it through the schools. I know that the letters will, the hard copies of the letters will be delivered to the central office, and central office will make sure that they are hand-delivered to our legislators. We want to make a very strong show. This is very critically important, these monies. As you'll hear tonight in our budget discussion, you know, those monies could really make the difference for us in really moving forward in what we want to do with our educational programming. So if you haven't signed the letter, you can still sign it. We felt very strongly, the task force felt very strongly, that delivering hard copies of the letters, numerous letters, would be far more effective than just sending it in an email format. So again, anyone who signed on for that, thank you so much. If you haven't, we'll definitely get the information to you. And then just kind of finally tonight, not to make a joke of it, but it does sort of feel like Groundhog Day. Here we are again, starting our budget discussions for the 2016-2017 school year, and we will also be going through some of our staffing recommendations, offering that to the board tonight as well. So I think we're kind of ready to move forward. So, I'm sorry, I just briefly want to have Ms. Fennick go through the enrollment report and an update on the kindergarten enrollment, and I'll be finished.
Thank you, Dr. Mooney. Kindergarten enrollment is now going on, and we have the projected number for next school year is at 420. As of February 2nd, we have 220 children registered, enrolled, and in as of January 27, 2016, our total enrollment, student enrollment, is 5,357 students. Last year we had 5,245, which makes a difference of an additional 112 students at this time. So, thank you.
I'll make a motion for the approval of minutes for January 19th, 2016. Do I have a second? Mrs. Johnson, all in favor? 6-0, thank you. And before we go to the discussion item, I just want to mention again that at the next public meeting, which is February 23rd, we will be having a community forum to discuss overriding the tax cap. We will be trying to come up tonight with a number of where we're thinking that might be a suggestion of where we'd start, and that will be at 8 o'clock. We will hold the public meeting at 7 and try to get through it all before the community forum. And now we'll go to the discussion item. Ms. Callahan.
Thank you, Mrs. Sloan. I think if it's all right with the board, I'm just going to sit here. I would rather have a simple conversation with you about where we stand at this time. To understand our starting point, it's important for us to know where we have been and why I am going to present to you facts and figures for the 16-17 school year. In looking through my records, I came across a number that even surprised me, that actually in 2010, we had 485 professional staff members, and we are down to we're down by 16 staff members at this point, down to 471, I think, or maybe it was 468 the last time I looked. That number does change fairly often, surprisingly enough. And at the same time, our student population has gone up by 316 students in 5 years. And you just heard Ms. Fennick say that we're up more than 100 students just from last year to this year. Those students, while we pride ourselves on great efficiencies, and we have been adding to class size at all levels, those students do need desks to sit in, they need textbooks to work with, and the associated supplies. So that is where I am placing us, at least for a point of reference. This is where we are. These are things that we know today that have impacted the very first draft of the school district budget. Fortunately, both the pension plans for the teachers' retirement system, which not only includes teachers, but all professionals licensed by the state of New York in the field of education, are included in the teachers' retirement system. And the employees' retirement system are those employees that you hear us refer to as civil service employees, consisting mainly of educational assistants, clerical folks, and our custodial staff. Those rates, which we are required by law to pay, which are based on their total salaries for the year, they have fluctuated just as the economy, stock market has fluctuated, all the equities. This year we did see that those two areas of the budget, while the TRS rate is 12% and ERS is 15.5, they are both lower than last year. And that would have been wonderful were it not for the fact that the health insurance premiums went up by an equal amount. 7% appears to be far different from 15, but in dollars, the increase for health insurance is $1.5 million, and the decrease in the two retirement systems was $1.6 million, so very little gain there. The tax levy limit of 0.0012, thank you, Governor and Legislature, ultimately turns out to be less than 2/3 of a point increase in the tax levy for the community. That number will not change at this point, regardless of what decisions the board may make relative to staffing. The maximum we will be able to tax the taxpayer is this 2/3 of 1% increase because of the vagaries of the formula. The budget increase that the administrators have looked at initially, which we have indicated as a rollover, simply means current staffing, no changes to the budget other than for supplies, equipment, furniture, the legal requirements of health insurance, any debt service that we have accumulated, Social Security, things that we need to balance the budget and match the salaries. So with a budget increase of 1.25, we would have approximately a $1.8 million increase. When I note for you that the tax levy limit is 0.0012, as I said, that's the technical number. The actual dollar amount is an increase throughout the community of approximately $800,000, and it's 2/3 of 1%. We have talked among the administrators and are going to present to the board this evening potential staffing increases, which, if considered by the board and we're given authorization to move forward, would result in an increase of 2.59% rather than the 1.25 rollover. And even now, with the simple rollover budget and the way the formula rolls, The gap between the state aid and the taxing ability that we have leaves us with approximately a $1.3 million gap. Over the years, we have referred to this as the board's contribution to reducing the tax levy. So with a rollover budget, we're talking about approximately $1.3 million that we are asking the board to consider taking from fund balance. If you attended our board meetings in the fall, when the auditors came and presented, we have approximately $4 million in what is referred to as an unassigned fund balance. And I think the number is approximately, well, I really want to look in my audit before I tell you what the entire fund balance is. I don't want to misstate millions of dollars. I'll look at that in a moment. If we look at the gap with the proposed staffing, it's closer to $3 million. We did get some notification from the state education department of the governor's proposal for state aid for Port Washington, which was touted as a big 4% increase. In fact, most of the increase in the aid that was coming to Port Washington is referred to as expenditure-driven aid, which means because we spent money last year, there's a percentage aid that's given back to the school district. It was not a gift from the state. The gift was an additional $198,000 in what is referred to as gap elimination aid. I hate to get too technical, but in order to understand this, it's important because there are two major issues relative to state aid that are happening now. Certain senators are speaking about increasing what's referred to as foundation aid. Foundation aid makes up about $4 million of our $8 million in aid. We are, quote unquote, frozen with that portion of our aid because we're considered to be wealthy. That's one question. Then there's gap elimination aid. 6 years ago, when the state could no longer balance its budget, it decided that it would take money away from school district state aid packages. And they came up with this term called gap elimination aid. So Port Washington at that time was supposed to get $6 million in aid for the year. Instead, they put a line in our output reports which simply said $6 million, gap elimination aid, minus $1 million, you get $5 million, Port Washington. The state took that $1 million and used it to help to balance the state's budget instead of giving it to the school districts. This happened in every school district in New York State. Over the years, we have lost close to $6 million. Last year, the state started to return part of the $1 million per year. This year, they're offering to return an additional $198,000. As the legislators try to determine where the final state aid package will be with the state budget that has to be approved supposedly by March 31st, certain people are lobbying for foundation aid, which is very helpful for poor districts. We will not see any money if that's what happens. If they decide to give additional gap elimination aid, that will help Port Washington. So when you read that in the newspaper, you'll understand the impact it will have here. Sorry for that long explanation. So we have a sense of what a basic budget would be. We're going to present to you the additional staffing that we believe is needed for our growing enrollment. We have some idea of what the state aid may or may not be. We need some information from the board at some point in this process regarding the use of fund balance, which will help us to determine how much of the staffing we can actually provide for. Now, this is actually starting to get into a little bit of the difference between where money comes from in Port Washington versus where money comes from for many other districts in the state. And this information did come from the Comptroller's office, and his information really online was from back in 12-13, but I really don't think that it has changed too much relative to the overall happenings in the state. As you can see on the right side of the screen, the Port Washington revenue from real property taxes is over 90% of the budget. State aid is about 5%, and the local revenues, which are really things like rental of school facilities and so on, is a very small amount of money. And then the balance has come from the Board of Education, which has averaged in my years here from $0 to $500,000 to $1.3 million, and 1 year to $3.9 million in order to help us maintain our program. When you look at the left side of the screen, you see that the average school district in New York State gets half of its money from property taxes and more than 34% from state aid. We are just considered far too wealthy, and that is why the burden is on the taxpayer, because the state believes that a free, appropriate education means that school districts who cannot afford that should be given more aid. So the pressure used to be always on the local taxpayer. Now, with the tax levy limit formula, that pressure has been determined in advance, and in order to maintain program, the board has limited options on how to do that other than going to fund balance. So back in 2010, as I said earlier, you can see where the board offset the taxes for the subsequent year. In 2009-10 by $1,059,000. In 2013-14, it really peaked because each year this process is unique. Either the levy limit is high enough for the board to maintain program from a financial perspective and state aid is high enough, or the opposite happens, and it therefore causes us to go in and take more of our savings. But if we're not able to replenish our savings, we're not going to be able to do that consistently over a long period of time. Last year, in developing the current budget under which we're working, there was a determination made to take $1 million out of the fund balance. At the same time, I just wanted you to see that through June of last year, we had lost over $5.7 million in that gap elimination aid. And while for the 15-16 school year, a portion of it was returned to us, approximately $400,000 out of the $1 million, we still lost $647,000, and in the proposal for next year, the $198,000 I mentioned earlier, that simply means that we're not getting the $1 million, we will get 600,000, and so we're still $448,000 short. The district would be in far better financial position and able to talk about not only maintaining but enriching program if we had this $6 million that has been taken from us. Before I go on to the category of fiscal stress, I do want to mention that in May, on the 17th, in addition to the budget proposal, the board is going to have a proposal for the sale of land up in Sands Point. We refer to that area as the Gatehouse. There is a 5-acre parcel of land near the Helen Keller Center, and I just want to make sure that that is public and that anyone who has questions about that additional proposition, if you feel free to speak to us about that as well. But sometimes when I get all caught up in the numbers, I lose sight of some of these ancillary items, and I wanted to make sure I mentioned that. You may have seen in the paper that Port Washington has a score of 31, which in a fiscal stress formula, which was created by the comptroller, DiNapoli. Fiscal stress, or this formula, was created to inform boards of education and the communities when there is a sense that there is a downward trend in savings and the availability of cash relative to expenditures. And there are also environmental issues that are a part of the formula that the comptroller created relative to property values, enrollment in your school district. If your property values go down, your enrollment goes down, your budgets start to go down, that's all considered very negative. This fiscal stress formula has been in place now for 3 years. Port Washington started out with a score of 8. This is one of those tests where you really like a low number instead of a high number. We went from 8 to 15, and now we're at 31. The only thing that has changed in Port Washington since it got its score of 8 the first year is the use of fund balance. Going back to this chart in 2013-14, that $3.9 million, when the board decided that we were going to maintain program even when the levy limit would not allow us to do that, we made a joint educational decision to take monies greater than usual out of our fund balance. In the course of planning for this meeting, happened to go back to my very first budget here in Port Washington, in which I explained to Dr. and Sarah the issues relative to fund balance at that time, and reviewed the fact that the first year I was here, the budget that had been developed prior to my coming, the board at that time with a $74 million budget had offset the tax levy by $1.6 million, which is not so different in ratio from doing 3.9 based on a $142 million budget at the time. So it's not that this has never been done in Port Washington before. It has to do with the belief in the importance of the educational program and looking out at the long range and trying to determine without a crystal ball which way the economy is going. So this is the scoring system. And anyone who comes up with a score of 0 to just under 25 gets no designation, so the last 2 years, Port had no designation. Now, at a score of 31, we are considered susceptible. And it's interesting to note that 20% of all the school districts that received either susceptible, moderate, or significant ratings from the comptroller were here on Long Island, because we have a very high cost of living. Some school districts, especially in Suffolk County, are seeing large enrollment increases, and we are being handcuffed with the tax levy limit formula. This is simply information from the Comptroller's Office that talks about the number of districts who have been in fiscal stress over the 3 years, those who have been in fiscal stress once, twice, 3 times, or never. And again, this is the distribution of the scores in a different format. Some people are more visual this way. So we are in the susceptible range. Only 7% of school districts in the whole state are in that range at this point. And again, designation. The major issue for most school districts is the low fund balance. And that is where we have found ourselves, that once we got under $10 million, and we were, I think, at 9.78, that was what weighted heavily in this scoring to put us in susceptible. Again, just more information on who was how many school districts were susceptible or moderately stressed, significantly stressed, and where we were in the years prior to this year. So, trying to understand that we have a fiscal stress issue. We have the lowest tax levy limit since the formula has been developed. We have growing enrollment, and we have great staffing needs. It's a difficult issue to get your heads around and to really work through and come up with the best plan for the school district. At this point, I'm going to hand the microphone over to Dr. Mooney, who would like to go through the staffing proposals and then give the board an opportunity to ask their questions.
Thank you, Mrs. Callahan, for that very comprehensive presentation. I know it is a lot of information for everyone to absorb, and I think sometimes we all need a few go-arounds to really understand it. As Mrs. Callahan mentioned, the district administration has taken a very serious look at what is happening programmatically and from a staffing perspective. And so, not to repeat, but we clearly have a growing enrollment, and we have seen over the years actually a reduction in staff. It is not only the enrollment that is driving some of these staffing requests, we also have some regulations, state ed regulations and mandates that are requiring us to take a closer look at how we're meeting the needs of our students. So as most people here are aware, the class size issue through all of our buildings, but particularly at the elementary school, has been something that has been a great challenge for us. It continues to be a challenge for us on a number of levels, but also from a space issue as well. However, looking at our kindergarten enrollment, the Board of Ed class size policy, our recommendation at this time is to add a total of 5 sections to the elementary schools. One of those sections would be at daily for first grade, under the assumption that we would also have 4 kindergartens. Guggenheim, we are looking for grade 5, 1 section. And Manor Haven, we are asking for 2 sections, one for the next year's 3rd grade and then for the 4th grade. At Salem, similar to Daly, we are looking to maintain the current 4 sections of kindergarten into 1st grade, and the projection does look as though Salem would also have 4 sections of kindergarten again. I do want to go back to Guggenheim and simply acknowledge that Guggenheim has need for sections in other grade levels. However, they are clearly, there is no additional space for those classrooms, so that's a different issue. We do need, as a district, we do need more ESL teachers. Now, part of that is due to, again, an increased ESL enrollment of students, as well as some changes to the regulations of the Part 154. So we are asking for a full-time another elementary ESL teacher, and how that position would be allocated, we still need to work through. Weber needs another teacher, and Schreiber. Again, this is related to changes in the Part 154 regulations, and we had this issue discussion last year. If across a particular grade level there are 20 students or more requiring bilingual, then we must offer that class to those students. However, this is a situation where parents do have the opportunity to decline that and to opt out. Last year, we did not have enough students to formulate a class. However, it was critical that we included that position in the budget so that we would be prepared to move that forward. So we are including the position again this year, and we may or may not need the position. We will go through a similar process again of determining whether enough students show the interest or not. We are also proposing a guidance counselor for Schreiber, and again, this is a restoration of a cut that was made several years ago. Once again, Schreiber High School is 1,600 students or a little bit more, and we feel that this is also an important need. There are proposed changes overall to school counseling and guidance ratios. They are currently in the proposal format, but if they were to go through, they would be looking, they could potentially require us to add additional guidance counselors, particularly at the elementary level. At this time, we are not including a recommendation for another elementary guidance counselor. However, we are exploring some grant opportunities. So if we were able to secure a grant for that type of position, then we would move forward in that manner. There are a few support areas where we are requesting some small increases in staff. At the special education program at Schreiber is growing, and so we are looking at this point to add a 0.2 position to that. We may need more as the years continue. At Guggenheim, due to the needs of the children, we're asking for an additional 0.2 speech. Elementary reading for that AIS support, we are looking at Guggenheim for a half a position. For math resource, student need shows us that we feel we should have an additional half-time math resource at Guggenheim and half resource at Manor Haven. That would be a full-time position. And then when you add class sections, some of the special areas also require some increases, and we are asking for increases, particularly in physical education. We have looked at the positions we have for art and music, and we feel that we can with the existing staff, at least for next year, but we really believe that the additional physical education sections are needed to support these other sections. So in the end, that would result in a full-time position. The increase on the instructional staffing total, I don't think you can see it on the slide, is an increase of 13.9 FTEs. And if you go back to Mary's first slide in the beginning, we said that we were down by 16 positions. We are not asking for all of the positions because we recognize that it cannot all be done in 1 year, and we also recognize and do appreciate the board's consideration for the positions that we are asking for. The additional cost of these positions would be close to $1.3 million. We do have some non-instructional positions that we are at least including in our draft. And these include a supervisor of operations. This would be a position to support the director of facilities as he works to manage our aging buildings as well as the bond issues as well. Some other non-instructional staff. There was a very good and serious discussion among the administration and from the Emergency Preparedness Committee to increase our security force. Currently at the elementary schools, we have shared security aides, and we would like to include and have a full-time security aide at each elementary school at Weber, and an additional security aid for the Schreiber for Campus Drive. Very important issue. And in terms of just any other teaching assistants, taking out what we may receive through CSE meetings, again, we feel at Schreiber we need a bilingual teacher assistant to support the students and the teaching staff at Schreiber as well. So if we take the complete total, combining the instructional requests with the non-instructional requests, that's an increase of 19.9 positions. Financially, that's an increase of about $1.6 million. One thing that I did want to just to remind everyone about the last few years since we have had the tax levy limit, which has been starting with the, I guess it was the 12-13 school year, that we have, the board and administration has worked very, very diligently not to have to override the tax cap, and that how budgeting occurs now is in a different, it occurs differently from the manner in which it used to happen. We are given a formula and a spreadsheet, and Mary has to plug in specific numbers. We see that there's some form of a gap between what it is that you know, we may be asking for in additional requests. The first year of the levy limit, I see it as a puzzle. The missing piece, there's always a missing piece, And it was the teachers, the Port Washington Teachers Association, who came forward and through a negotiation and extension of their contract because of what they did not receive in terms of a cost of living increase and some other givebacks, we had the money to close that gap, with the board still putting in kind of the historical amount from reserves. The second year of the levy limit, we still had a reduction from the teachers. It was still not enough to close the gap, and that was the year that the board determined that we value our educational programs and maintaining them to such an extent that they agreed to add in the $3.9 million from reserves, which is more than what has been done, again, in the past. Last year, we were able to close that gap from a couple of different sources, and those occurred because there was a reduction in the teacher retirement system contribution. That was one big piece that filled the gap, and we did receive a little bit more in state aid than we typically do, and then the board did include from reserves, but kind of back to the more typical contribution this year. But I will say, even with last year's budget, as many people here are aware, we were not able to have some of the staffing recommendations fulfilled that we probably needed. And so this year, we are looking at the different ways that the board has, the different options the board has to consider, whether it is just the rollover budget or it is a budget that includes our staffing recommendations or some variation of our staffing recommendations, some other modifications to the draft budget, and whether it would be from fund balance, an override, or a rollover. So that's our first presentation of the budget and the numbers, and we'll be happy to take any questions.
Just want to start by thanking Mrs. Callahan for your presentation and for Dr. Mooney, your input on the staff recommendations. Before I turn it over to the budget chair, I just want to say, I'm speaking for myself, but I really do think I'm speaking for the entire board, that the staff recommendations, none of them seem optional. And so one way or another, I think we're going to have to find our way there. And I just also want to thank the staff on behalf of myself and the Emergency Preparedness Committee taking our recommendation for the additional security guards. I think it's very important, so I'm pleased to see it in there. And Mr. Bear, if you want to begin.
Thank you. For me personally, I think we slowly reach a so-called tipping point as a school district where sort of the shell game that's gone on for the past few years of patching holes, we slowly run out of it. The tax cap increase of 0.0012 coupled with the minimum, and then because of the eliminations driving it down to what actually I calculate as 0.0065, which is in line with Mary's 0.66, really deprives us just between what the formula says and what we end up with of about $500,000. If you use an average tax in Port Washington somewhere in the neighborhood of $11,000, $11,500 for school taxes, we're talking about an increase of $75 year over year at that rate. I don't think that we can function with increasing enrollment and without additional money being plugged in. Whether that comes over the long run in terms of additional state aid between now and the budget vote, or it comes from the community, I think we have to consider that each 0.1% is worth roughly, Mary, 130,000 thereabouts on 132 million. right? So when you look at the entire calculation, my own juggling of the numbers puts it somewhere in the neighborhood of an override of roughly 0.7%, which is really takes us from 0.66 basically to about 1.3%, and that would raise in the neighborhood of $900,000 of additional funding as far as the budget is concerned. You know, there's always going to be some line items in the budget that I think we can work on. There's some of the rollover money that will occur from the 15-16 budget going into the 16-17 budget. And when you start to piece all of that together, plus some money that we would take again out of the fund balance, I think we can pretty much come close to then a net zero. I mean, when you look at the overall increase, we're driving roughly 3.4 million between the budget itself and then the new staffing, 3439 exactly. And the 0.66 only gets us 850,000, and that's simply not enough. There is nothing that is forecast so far to slow down the student increase. Even though we experienced a decline in kindergarten enrollment by 15 or 20 children, we are still year over year up by 112, mostly in the secondary schools in Weber and Schreiber. If that trend were to continue, as we've discussed previously, we get buried by that slowly. Whether you want to say that it's $5,000 more a student, $10,000 more a student, if you use our $27,000, you're talking about $3 million of money that should just go in to help educate those 112 kids. And use $10,000, it's 1.1 million. And that money is just not coming from anywhere unless we start to push a little bit on this artificial cap. The original designation, if you go back and read the legislation, it was designed to slow down the growth of property taxes across the state of New York. The 2% levy was there. At the time they put it through, it was imagined that the cost of living would have always been 2% or more, and that this scenario we are now in, where it's 1.0012, was really not envisioned coupled with districts increasing enrollment. We have no benefit like other school districts do where enrollment is going down, where you see other districts closing buildings and getting some economy out of that. We are exactly the opposite. We are full in classes. We need added sections. We need added E&L help at secondary level. There's just on and on and on when you look at the 19 positions. And that just doesn't materialize out of efficiencies or some other miracle divining rod where we're going to get that money. The community has to step up at some point and put what really, in my little calculation here, is another $75 above the first $75. And when you look at Port Washington from end to end, and I take it from whether you're retired or not and where you are in the continuum, we can afford $149 as the average tax increase in this community. And there'll be some people who come to the mic and say they can't afford it, but what we can't afford is to have a school district that suddenly gets wiped out because we can't find $75 across 10,000 Class 1 houses to raise enough money to balance the school budget.
Also, I'm sorry, Mrs. Sloan. Again, it didn't appear on the slide, so I do apologize. This does not change the overall total number of the staffing recommendations, but Schreiber is also asking for the restoration of a business teacher, and that position would then, we do have some other staff members in some other areas teaching business to kind of cover that, so that would free them up to teach, say, English class or others. So I just wanted, I do apologize, just wanted to make sure that I stated that since it wasn't on the slide. So.
All right, so I'm trying to figure out how to formulate this question so it makes sense. Mary, on the slide that shows the revenue from us being 91.4% from our taxes compared to the average through the state, which is a couple back. It's the double slide. So does that mean that in districts that receive less from property taxes, that they pay more per pupil? Or is it just, so if we had equal districts, is it we both $10 million, but 9.1 comes from our property tax and 4.8 comes from their property tax, and they spend the same amount if they had 5,000 students? Do you like, I'm trying.
They get, sorry, I didn't have the mic on. Those less wealthy districts can be funded up to 90% of the cost of all construction projects. So, in a simple response, yes, if it's $10 million budget and a $10 million budget and half the money comes from the state versus 90% coming from the taxpayer is paying less of the total cost of that budget.
Also, we hear a lot of times unfunded mandates, which includes stuff like the computers for park assessments, which we in turn are using in our schools otherwise in E&L, like the new regulations through the Part 154. And it's very hard to put a number on what the number is for unfunded mandates. But is there a way to try to figure a number so that we can include this in letters that we might write, or any type of information that we would be giving, saying, you know, we now need a kindergarten teacher, which includes transportation costs, so that's X amount, and that's a mandate that they're telling us that we need.
One thing, the superintendents have received a memo from the commissioner asking for a listing of unfunded mandates, or, you know, what if we were to ask for mandate relief, what would be our recommendations. Now, this was done a few years ago as well, and the Superintendents Association is sending a very comprehensive list of what those issues are, because they're numerous, they're in a variety of areas. So I don't know that anything will result from it, but at least I can tell you that the commissioner is seeking the information and the input on it, because that's really up to that comes through the Board of Regents and the commissioner and how they develop their regulations.
And how does one figure out their free and reduced lunch population? Is that based on income tax returns, and then each district does it? Is it federal? Is it state? How is that determined?
There is criteria provided to the school district. There is a totally confidential application that is completed, and it can even be completed by a representative in the school district if the families are either unwilling or uncomfortable filling out those forms. And it is based on a documentation that must be provided. The verification is done locally, and it's maintained confidential in a particular office and available if someone from the federal lunch program wants to come and review it.
And lastly, since you mentioned it earlier, the sale of the property in Sands Point, that would be an X amount of money for whenever it sells. That would be put into the budget for whatever that year is? Would it go into fund reserves, or how would that impact any type of budget?
Any revenue that comes to the school district, as the sale of property would be, is considered, excuse me, a general fund revenue. If it were a school building, there is a requirement that the total value of the sale be returned incrementally over a 10-year period to the taxpayer. The sale of land is not covered specifically under that general regulation. However, I did pull out the audit to get to the general fund fund balance. With a fund balance of $12 million, 4 of which is considered unassigned, and we're talking about 1 year the board providing $4 million to offset the cost of a program, that $12 million won't last very long. So if you sell land, regardless of whether you get $50,000 or $5 million, it will go into the general fund balance and will ultimately be used to offset taxes in the future for the taxpayers.
I just had one question that you sort of touched on, but I just want to be clear. So when the legislatures are banding about these numbers and increasing state aid, we are absolutely frozen as far as our foundation aid. So if they're talking about foundation aid, we absolutely will not see any more money under that umbrella. So the only place we might is through the restoration of GEA. Is that correct?
Yes, unless they change formulas for textbook aid, transportation aid. There are about 16 different categories, but they're small amounts of money relative to the overall pot of $8 million. So textbook money might be $200,000. The two major areas are GEA and foundation, and because of our wealth, we will not see any money in foundation aid. I would simply like to have them to return to Port Washington taxpayers the money that the Port Washington taxpayers should have been given over the past 6 years.
Thank you. I have one silly question, and I'll get to some silly comments. Is it possible that we could pay some of the director of operations or the supervisor of operations salary through the bond for the period that they're spending significant amounts of time on the bond? Again, it wouldn't be significant, but it could potentially free up a little bit of money that we could use for something else.
I have never had this question asked of me and would probably prefer legal research. However, I would say that if we're spending the money on an employee, it's less money we will be spending on a building or improving a facility.
Okay. Then, yeah, okay.
And in addition, the money from the bond is borrowed money, so you'd be paying interest on the salary.
Right. No, I understand. Just, you know, we're tight here. I'm just looking for places that we could possibly get a little looser. Just want to point out that.
I'm sorry, Larry, could I just add to that,
Yeah.
just in thinking long-term? You know, there is a part of the bond that's looking to also expand, you know, buildings, so there's going to be more to oversee and supervise, so, you know, we're just thinking more long-term on
Right.
it.
Yeah, and then, well, that was part of it. We're going to be taking more and more of these people's time to be working on the bond and less to be doing their other positions. So where I'm not a big proponent of paying out current costs over 30 years, in some way, if this were a private business and you had an employee working on a construction project, the IRS would make the case that salary should be capitalized into the cost of the building, because it really is a building construction cost, not a current cost. But anyway, Just a couple of things. The New York State uses something called the regional cost difference. And in their considered opinion, the cost of living on Long Island is 1.5 times what it is on the rest of the state, or 50% more. Actual figures sort of belie that, and it's more like twice as high. But even based upon that, Long Island has 17% of the students and 12% of the funding, which turns out that Long Islanders pay around 8% of their income in real estate taxes, and the rest of the state pays about 5%. So New York State is underfunding education island-wide, and certainly we are being caught up in that. Additionally, if you use their 1.5 figure and you divide through by the cost per student average on Long Island, we are at the median of New York State. So even based upon their figure, which is off, if you actually use the 2.0 figure instead of the 1.5 figure, we actually spend a lesser percentage of our sort of GDP on education than they do in the rest of the state, and we get better results from it. So but that isn't really relating to our bond so much, but to our budget so much. But I'm concerned about our fiscal stress because the stock market ended 2015 a little lower than it started 2015. If we are in a cyclical bear market, and the cyclical bear market started in May, the average time that it would probably hit bottom would be around October of 2015, if the past is any predictor of the future, which means we will probably close 2016 lower than we've closed 2015, which means we'd have 2 years of declining stock markets, which means that come 2 or 3 years down the road, our ERS and TRS numbers are going to climb, and we have to start thinking about that now by keeping our reserves larger rather than smaller, and which would keep us off the fiscal stress list, but also just makes a lot of logical sense. We know that these expenses are going to be coming. We also know if the stock market is down and the economy is slowing, we're not going to get 2%. We're not going to get a 2% raise next year in our tax cap limit. That's going to be relatively low because the costs are going to stay relatively low because the economy is going to be relatively slow. So we've got a lot. So we can't figure out that next year we can't figure out that this 0.12 is an aberration. Maybe we'll get a 0.21 next year if we're lucky, but we're not going back up to 1.6, 1.7 so quickly. And so I think all of that belies the fact that we're going to need to put as much in our bank as we can and rely as little on our fund balance as we can going forward, if we want to take a longer term look at the financial condition of the schools, which ties into the fact that I think we really may need to see if the community is willing to support the educational program. And I would say not as we're trying to put it back to where it was, but maybe even try to make it a little bit better and try to grow it a little bit. I think if people are going to be paying, they'd like to see something for some return on their investment rather than getting back to what they used to have. So, but that's a discussion, I guess, for our next meeting. Did I have any other notes here? Also, our increase in population, again, you might have better figures than me, but if we're talking about the area in general, a lot of these students who are coming in are needier students. So it's not like we're just popping them in classrooms, but a lot of them do need ESL services. A lot of them are, have other needs and are a little bit on the more costly side to educate. And so certainly that has to be factored in, that our growth is not just like, oh, we've gotten 100 more students we can divide through by our 27,000 and that's what we need. We probably need a little bit more than that because some students are less expensive to educate and some students are more expensive to educate. So that's another thing just to keep in mind as we go forward. And I just saw in Newsday the other day, it takes $97,000 to be middle class on Long Island. So, we want to talk about the cost differential of being here and being somewhere else. And that's a scary number when wages are not keeping pace with, with growth and everything else, which, makes it harder on everybody. But it's something that we have to, it's something that we really have to be working on a state level, again, long term, to adjust the foundation formulas, to adjust how the regional cost differences and all of that. But in the interim, again, we're going to have to make this up here while we can, until we can start getting some of the relief that's going to take us a longer time to put into place.
Okay, well, as I said earlier in the evening, I think for the purposes of the community forum, we need to have some kind of number that we're starting out with on the question to the community: would you be willing to support this as a number to override the tax cap? And I really agree with Alan that I think it's certainly worth asking our community, would you be willing to add it to be a 1.3%, because we had always been dealing with the idea that it would be 2%, and it's gone lower and lower and lower, and we've made more and more and more cuts, and we can't sustain the school district the way I think all of us want to in this community unless we find the money somewhere. And it seems reasonable this year to be asking for that much from the community. But that's just my opinion, and it's just Mr. Bear's opinion and perhaps other board members' opinions, and we need to hear from the community. So I think that's a good starting point. I think it is important to get the word out. We'd really like to hear from everyone, and I would like to ask the board if that's a number that everyone's comfortable with starting as a starting point. It's not our hard and fast belief, but we have to start somewhere for the purposes of discussion. So, Chris?
That number of 1.3%, does that include still pulling the 1 million or 1.1 million out of reserves? So we're still pulling money out of reserves, just not as much. Is that correct?
I think that's...
Well, I think you're using Mr. Bear's numbers, and he and I have a very friendly friction relative to the numbers. I will go back certainly and study the numbers, but I believe that if we were to increase the staffing as you have seen it proposed this evening, that the, let me make sure I have this right now, that the levy would change from 0.65 increase, 2/3 of 1%, that's the easiest way to say it, it would become 1.6% increase in the levy. And you would like to know, I'm sure, what the dollar amount of that is and what the cost to the average homeowner would be. So we would go back and work those numbers up for you.
So we would, obviously we'll have a lot of this information to get out to the community before the forum. But I think we can, split the difference and start out with a discussion at 1.5%, if everyone's okay with that. That is with taking out the 1.3. But again, we can put that out to the community for discussion and amongst ourselves. But really that night, I would like to hear from the community. If we did this and we did take something from our reserves and we asked for something more from the community, how does that sit with everyone? I've heard from a lot of people that they would not support overriding the tax cap. I've heard from others, one of them sitting on the board here, that he would go up to 6% if it meant that we could do better for the school district and the students. So we need to really have a better sense of where everyone is with it, because we have to make a plan for the budget vote pretty soon. I mean, we have to have that number before April. So I think February 23rd is a good time to start asking the community, and I would suggest the 1.5%. Is everyone okay with that?
I would rather do it without any money from reserves and see what that number would be. So I mean, I guess I'd like to start out with, with as many different numbers as we can get. What is it if we put nothing in reserves? What is it if we put 1.3? What if we do this? What if we do that? Different parameters of where we would end up with it, so we're not just picking figures out because they sound nice. I mean, if it's 1.6, it's 1.6. I don't think there's any benefit to saying, let's call it 1.5 because it sounds better. So
It's not about it sounding better. It's about the discrepancy between Mary and Alan, and in my experience, they come in somewhere in the middle.
to Chris's original question, I can give you the rundown just of where I'm coming from on this. I believe within the budget, as it exists, the draft, that there is roughly $250,000 that I think that we could probably take out. It's always painful to do that, but I think that you have to work both sides of it to make the numbers meet. At a real 1.3%, we raise roughly 1.775 in new money in total. Estimate, again, and this is going like this, there's roughly $500,000, hopefully, and that's, again, crawl out on the end of the branch and start sawing behind you, in the 15-16 budget that we could roll over into the 16-17 budget without touching, at the moment, fund balance as it exists at $4 million. I am gambling, again, that there will be some more state aid of some shape or form, so I have plugged that in at $190,000. We still have not factored in, to the best of my knowledge, retirements and the change at the moment that we have been discussing with PEP. That figure is a rough number, $250,000, $300,000 if you take all of those positions into account. And that leaves me at the moment $425,000 short, which would have to come out of the existing fund balance as it sits today. If you increase, as Mary has pointed out, another 0.3%, with each one being worth $132,000 roughly, that gets you another $400,000, and you would be at zero with most of those same work-throughs. So whether it's 1.3, 1.6, if you want to leave the $250,000 in, you'll have to play with that a little bit more. But I think there are areas that, just in looking at the draft, that we could probably come up with that money and start to squeeze it towards. There are variables right there. It could be that instead of $500,000, we only have $300,000 left over in this year's budget to not put in and take out. So then you've got a little bit of a gap there. I really do think there will be more state aid. I don't think that it's politically expedient for the legislators to not come up with some formula, whether it's not foundation or something else. I really think we will see some more money there. We have opportunities still to realize other savings on the staffing side. So I think that we can piece that together. I think fundamentally the question is whether it's 1.3, 1.4, 1.5. Those amounts are marginal increases when you really think that each 0.001 that we're talking about is roughly $6 or $7 a year in taxes when you look at the average homeowner, because the 0.66 is roughly 75. Again, using 11,500, broad generalization there, could be higher or lower slightly, but you work that out. $75 by 12 is $6.40 or something like that a month. So I don't know that that really plays into it. I think it's more now the question of, can we fundamentally support a budget that is greater than the tax cap in order to deliver education in Port Washington, still far below 2%, but above what is a penalty-driven, if you will, amount of 0.66. It just is impossible based on the laws that we function under, contract law and everything else that we're obligated to live by, mandates, whatever you want to list. It is impossible to function a school district with increasing enrollment at 0.66. There is no way to do it. And you can come to the microphone now and then you can harangue the teachers and say that they should be part of the solution. But honestly, there aren't any workforces that I know of who are suddenly just going to say, oh yeah, we'll give you back 10% of our salary so that the taxpayer doesn't have to support education for $60 more in a year. I don't think that that's really a workable solution. We have to come to the point where if you live in a community where the enrollment keeps going up, This is not a fictitious push on the budget. It's not like we dropped 500 kids and we still want to break through the tax cap. This is 112 more kids. You could have another 100 more next year if the same pattern exists. And you need more money to pay for classes, teachers, supplies, and everything else. It's just the way it is.
Yeah, I agree with almost everything Alan said. I think if we're looking at this, we have to be making conservative assumptions. We can't be saying, oh, we're going to have rollover money, oh, we're going to have this, oh, we're going to have that. I think the worst thing in the world to do would be to get our community to come out, support the tax cap, and then say, oh, by the way, you're not getting any new textbooks because we thought we'd get some money which we didn't get. I would much rather be stuck with the uncomfortable problem of, we have too much money. What are we going to do with it? Gee, we could put it in our fund balance. That would be, especially since whatever we set the limit at this year is our base for the following year. So it is a permanent bang for our buck. And so, and since each particular 1/10 is as Alan said, a sort of marginal amount, I would much rather start with Mary's figure and say, okay, maybe we overshot it, we have a little bit more, rather than saying, okay, let's just make our education just a slightly, maybe a tiny bit better than it is now, instead of trying to actually, give the kids what they actually do need, instead of saying, or worse yet, we're going to pierce the tax cap, so we're only being a little bit worse next year than we are this year. I think if we're going to do it, we might as well do it, to the kids' best interest. And again, I don't think there's going to be a huge difference in voter turnout between 1.3, 1.5, 1.6. So I would say let's start with the one that the administration feels most comfortable that they can meet the needs with. And if we happen to have some spare money, I'd love to be part of that conversation. So.
Okay, so I think for the purposes of communicating to the community what we're discussing at the forum, we'll have the 1.6% option with some number, which Mary will fine tune that and get it out to the rest of the board and then to the community. Some contribution from the fund balance. The number it would be for that same increase plus the fund balance money that we would not contribute. So whatever the number would be without any fund balance contribution, and then no override. And so we'll work to communicate that to the community for the forum. Okay. Anybody else? Are we done with this discussion for this evening? Okay, thank you. Let me just find my agenda. Okay. Committee. Budget, I think we've covered it enough. Although we will be having discussion in a moment about the construction manager that we did review at the last meeting. I skipped policy, sorry, policy.
We had our last policy and personnel meeting on this past Friday, the 29th. We had a lively and pretty comprehensive discussion about the district policy on returning tests and assessments, as well as the policy on teachers tutoring. It's an ongoing discussion, but it was well-attended meeting and something we will be continuing to look at. Our next meeting is on February 26th, and we have a couple of potential topics left of the goals that we've set for the year. I need to consult with Mrs. Fennick, and we'll post what the topic of the next meeting is going to be after discussing it with the rest of the committee. But you're all welcome to come, February 26th.
Curriculum, Larry?
Curriculum, we met on January 22nd, and we welcomed our newest committee member, Chris Naldoni, who replaced Mr. Hohauser. We had an amazing meeting. We had all of the directors who could make it, one couldn't make it, describe what they do. And I mean, I wish we had filmed it, and next time somebody comes and complains about administrators, we could strap them to a chair and make them watch it. Because what every single one of those people do is amazing that, if their titles reflected what they did, we wouldn't be able to fit it on their business card. So, it really is a credit to all of the administration about how much they accomplish and what they do, and how, dedicated they are to their jobs, and how they really are in it for the kids 100%. And, anyway, I'd love to be able to get out some notes on it, or maybe get out a little bit of what they had said, and maybe post it on the website, because I really think it'd be fascinating for people to read. And I don't remember when our next meeting is, but it's within a week of the policy meeting.
It's the week before, I think.
Yeah, February 12th, Lincoln's birthday, for those of us old enough to remember him.
It's the library media specialist? The library media specialist?
Yes, and it will be the library media specialists.
Okay. I'll now move to the action items, A1 through B5. Do I have a second? Ms. Johnson, all in favor? 6-0, thank you. And now, any old business? Okay, for new business, we are going to move on to a discussion about the interviews we held for the construction management firm. And Mrs. Callahan, do you want to start that? Or Mr. Bear? Who? Mary?
An RFP was sent out to approximately 12 companies. 7 companies responded. 5 companies were interviewed. We went from very small concerns, truly a father-son company, to a very large Manhattan-based firm. And the range of services were dependent upon the pricing, and I think that overall the board was pleased with a number of the companies who were presented, and in the end, the best value for our money and the ability to start on the project immediately seemed to focus around one company called School Construction, and I wanted to make sure that I understood the general consensus of the attendees, but certainly leave it open for the board for their discussion this evening.
In the general discussion, thank you, Mary. During the interviews, as Mary commented, there were a lot of pros and cons to all of, at least as we sort of debriefed on it, a lot of pro and con on each group, the bids they had submitted, and their ability to handle the project over what is, in our case, a prolonged period of time versus some of the other projects which can be done on a faster schedule. Really, our outline is 6, 7, 8 years. And based on that, and I think there was a lot of weight given to Jim's comments of how well they've been able to manage existing projects, their integrity, their ethics, and also their ability to help now on the performance bond Johnson Control bid, I think goes a long way to the school construction group being the best contender, if you will, and the best for the district, because that is an additional $5 to $6 million of money we'll be spending over a period of time. And I think they will be a good pair of eyes to make sure that all of the things that Johnson has recommended we will earn money back on over the timeline of the project that we actually do, or they may find that there may be things within that project that we don't even need to do.
I think we were all in agreement at the committee meeting that that was the direction we wanted to go into with that firm. So does anyone have any objections, or should we proceed? Okay, I think what the feeling was that if we could all agree and we could move forward with this tonight, that the sooner we could get them started with us, the better. So I believe, Mrs. Callahan, do you have a resolution for us?
I brought a blank resolution so that we could insert whatever name, and I had the fee amount. So,
I think it's worth mentioning that we did negotiate with them on their fee, and they did lower the cost of their fee to meet the other lower bid.
right,
And they are also adding the work on the Johnson Control with that included.
right, it did have that added value.
Okay.
That would be great.
Okay, I'm going to make a motion for the following resolution. Mrs. Callahan, go.
But I need a second.
Oh, Mr. Bear.
Okay. Resolved that the Board of Education, upon the recommendation of the Superintendent of Schools, appoint school construction consultants as the construction management firm for the bond authorized by the voters in May 2015, the contract price of $2,198,950. Be it further resolved that the Board of Education authorizes the board president to enter into the appropriate construction management contract with school construction consultants upon approval of the district's council. Thank you.
Good evening. So, I have to say that I'm very, very concerned about the stress on our district. I think we've been talking about this for quite a long period of time. I just don't see, for so long, we've been up against budgetary woes, and yet we have not addressed the systemic situation, and it's hard for me to get my hands around the idea of piercing the cap until we at least, as a part of the process, put in and find long-term agreements with our bargaining units that are going to give us a sense of fiscal security. And I think it's incumbent upon us to make sure that that happens. Now, I'm also concerned a little bit about the way this debate is being framed. As if you want to keep your education, you must pierce the tax cap. I think we have some serious decisions to make. And as a taxpayer, parent of a poor school kid, I think before we go into the meeting on the 23rd, it would be very helpful if we could get an analysis of the last, let's say, 5 budgetary cycles to take a look at what are our largest areas in growth in terms of costs. And I'm talking about an analysis of everything, school by school, department by department, all of the various cost centers that we have to look at, whether it be ENL, whether it be gifted and talented, whether it be AP and honors, PEP, special ed. I think the community should be able to take a long, hard look at the factors that are driving our financial situation so that we can walk into that meeting with a real understanding of where we're at, so that we make sure that we're working together in honestly discussing and resolving this situation.
30 seconds.
And then finally, I get back to the concept of where we are with our teachers and as our largest unit. And we have made commitments to them, and I think we need to support them. But I think long term, we have got to find a new salary structure for new hires that are going to give us the security that we need so we don't find ourselves in this situation year after year. And it's incumbent upon us to find a way to make that happen.
3
Thank you.
minutes. Excuse me, Mrs. Sloan, I believe you had one other action item on the agenda for board policy. Okay, just wanted you to know.
Are there any other community comments? Yep.
My name is Ronald Rochester. That is a question regarding where you're going to go as far as the funding. I know you have the bond that's going to fund a number of these items. At this point, when do you expect any of the this to take place as far as the improvements are concerned in the athletic fields and so in that standpoint? What's your time frame?
I'm sorry, we have a policy, we don't answer questions at the meeting, but if you want to submit them to us, we would be happy to,
Sure. All right. I'll
or after the meeting.
do. In a separate note, something that was today. I got in the mail the Port Washington Pride thing, and the superintendent made a couple of statements regarding security, but and security of students. One of the things that I question just to preface that, I'm retired federal agent and I work in school security, so I have a pretty well knowledge of how security and school security should work. And one of my questions was, we're spending money regarding these getting architects and developing plans to redesign the school vestibules and you know that we're talking about utmost attention to security, but have we reviewed and looked at these architects? What kind of experience do they have in security? Are we spending money on architects who really are giving us plans who are not going to fulfill what we really need as far as protecting our students?
Again, I'd be happy to talk to you after the meeting. Thank you.
All right. So, one other question, though. As far as the budget, you stated it would be the budget workshops are concerned. Are those part of the regular Board of Education meeting, or are they supposed to be separate on the calendar?
The forum, yeah, just so everyone knows, in case I wasn't clear, that the next scheduled public meeting is February 23rd. We're going to hold that meeting at 7 p.m., hopefully get done with all the business by 8, and then have the community forum the same evening at 8 o'clock. And they'll be posted as such on the website and any advertising.
That'll include the budget workshop you're talking about.
Were you talking about the committee meetings or the community forum?
It was stated that you're going to have public budget workshops.
We're having, community forum on the budget, which will be on February 23rd.
Okay, because on the calendar it doesn't state that the...
We just decided, so it's going to be posted.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jim Ansel, President of Citizens for School Management. Not that you should ever publicly, discuss how you're going to handle security in the schools, but I strongly recommend that you include Mr. Rochester, who has absolutely understated his credentials in security and anti-terrorist action. So I'm really hopeful that you'll include Mr. Rochester to any, actually, you'll be getting a highly paid consultant for nothing. So I thank you for your varied and interesting comments, and on a personal basis, I'm happy to see that Bernie Sanders did so well.
We'll move from community comments, and I am going to make a motion to approve the following policies for adoption. Policy 5252R and policy 6410. Do I have a second? Mrs. Johnson, all in favor? 6-0. Thank you. We are adjourned.